This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khanam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, as we speak right now, the ceasefire between the Israelis and the Palestinian group in Gaza, Hamas, has begun. Israelis are being released. Palestinian prisoners are being released. And it's important to note that in the time between when the United States announced it and when the ceasefire actually became reality, over 200 Palestinians were murdered, including at least 40 children. But the ceasefire begins. It's going to be for 6 weeks. Benjamin Netanyahu received an assurance from the American administration, both Biden and Trump, that after 6 weeks he could continue the genocide and the war in Gaza. We're going to be covering all of those events and political events today on Arab Talk. We're gonna actually hear first from human rights attorney and activist Stanley Cohen. He's going to discuss the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, and it's a very compelling interview. Jamal, thanks for doing it.
Yeah, and so we're talking about the first phase. Of course, we can't predict what's going to happen in phase 2 because they don't even have the details. They won't have the details till 2 weeks before the beginning of phase 2, and then of course we'll know nothing about phase 3, or we know very little about phase 3. So let's hear and watch Stanley Cohen. 15 months of Israel's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza has killed more than 47,000 people, the majority of them women and children. It has destroyed the healthcare system, displaced 2 million people, and famine is rampant. All over the world, millions of people have protested Israel's carnage. They set up encampments on campuses and besieged government officials to demand a ceasefire. Finally, on Wednesday, January 15th, 5 days before Donald Trump's inauguration, Qatar announced a ceasefire agreement. Both President Biden and incoming President Trump are taking credit for the agreement, with Biden claiming that it is the exact same deal he proposed 8 months ago. The first 6-week phase of ceasefire has begun on Sunday morning, January 19th. Based on Israel's past bad faith in previous agreements, the potential for the current phased ceasefire to be derailed on any number of pretexts is strong. Joining us on Arab Talk this week to talk about what took so long and the components of the phased ceasefire is Stanley Cohen, human rights attorney and activist. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Stanley.
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure as always to be able to share this terrible moment. Many people are calling it a wonderful moment. It's wonderful for the West. It's wonderful for Zionism. It is anything but wonderful for the millions of Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians that have been tortured, displaced, murdered, their lives, families, communities destroyed by Israel and by not just the war criminal Joe Biden, but a liar Joe Biden. He had nothing to do with the settlement, so-called settlement of this process. In fact, he fed it, he sired it, he approved of it throughout his 4 years.
So let's go to the heart of the matter. Millions of people all over the world, anybody with an iota of humanity wanted to see a stop to the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, the majority of them women and children. Now Biden is stating that this is the same ceasefire that was on the table 8 months ago. Why didn't he pressure Israel to implement it, especially when there is a precedent, for example, Ronald Reagan forcing Israel to stop its massacre in Lebanon? Instead, Biden kept the flow of arms and bombs going that killed tens of thousands more Palestinian children.
Well, let me say this. I'm not calling him a liar specifically around his generic genocide position. There was a better, or at least the same proposal that was on the table a year ago. It involved a much more expeditious release of the hostages here are Palestinians. Most of the people that were being held in Gaza are captives under international law. A better if not the same plan, was on the table more than a year ago. I know of this firsthand. I know that on two occasions, this plan, including more people, including those that have since passed, largely as a result of Israeli bombs and execution, would have been released. More Palestinians would have been released. But the combination of Netanyahu working this for political ends and Biden being unable to get beyond his Zionist roots, his Zionist career, his Zionist history, fed this genocide, a new iteration of genocide that's been going on for over 75 years. Biden could have stopped this 8 months ago, 10 months ago, a year ago, by simply picking up a phone and telling Netanyahu, you're not getting any money, you're not getting any guns, you're not getting any bombs, and you're not getting any support. But he chose not to. He chose not to because of AIPAC and because of ADL and because of Zionist funders and because the Democratic Party is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It likes to talk peace. Meanwhile, historically, it has fed war, and that's what happened. Joe Biden is a liar. The death of probably 100,000 or more women and children is on his hands. The destruction of Gaza, which it's unlikely we'll never again realize unless there is a one-state resolution. Even under the old, quote-unquote, pre-October 7th Gaza, the infrastructure, the school system, the hospital system that was in place, Biden has approved, has funded, has financed, and has supported the slaughter since he entered office 4 years ago.
The consensus is that Trump pressured Netanyahu to accept it and was not going to take no for an answer. What do you think his message was, and do you think concessions on another front were made, for example, the annexation of the West Bank?
No, Trump likes to take credit for the beginning of the earth. Anything that is positive anywhere at any time, and if it's not, he just lies about it, he makes it up. Trump played absolutely no role in this whatsoever. Yes, Netanyahu was very much aware that Trump is a fellow traveler. Yes, Netanyahu was aware that the seeds for this level of the genocide were planted more than 4 years ago under the Trump administration, when he gave the green light for the annexation of the Golan, when he moved the Israeli embassy to Quds, when he entered into a whole host of illegitimate and illegal international contracts and agreements, when he supported the Abraham Accords. So the notion that Donald Trump took credit, yes, he should take credit because he's a criminal, he's a thief, he's a goneth, using the phrase in Yiddish. So to the extent that Donald Trump was coming in, Netanyahu saw it as a perfect opportunity to break bread with Trump, to allow Trump to take credit for this, to give Trump fuel for further corruption in the region. But he had nothing to do with this. Netanyahu realized that there was nothing left to destroy. There were very few people left to kill. Starvation and rampant disease was underway. The world community was clearly moving against him. There was an arrest warrant for him. Don't be surprised if Trump on day one turns around and says he's got more control internationally and more power than the ICC and pardons Netanyahu. This is a maniacal force who would take credit for anything and reject everything that is evil, that is dark, and that is corrupt. That is Donald Trump. But Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both the creation of an anti-Semitic country, and Semitism being not Jews from Poland, but Arabs, that have long existed. I would expect Trump to turn around over the next few days and impose another variation of the Muslim ban. Meanwhile, expect press conferences with bin Salman, with other members of the UAE, with new financial deals. You'll see Kushner back in the region. So sure, Trump is taking credit for it, but Netanyahu realized he had reached the end. He's able to stand up and take credit. He has committed unspeakable mayhem in the name of Zionism in Israel. And all of this was to save his own political posture and to protect him from his own criminal prosecution and possible prison in what has proven to be once again a corrupt Israeli judicial system.
Regarding Biden's complicity in this genocide, he recently sat for an interview during which he admitted he had full knowledge of Netanyahu's intention to carpet bomb Gaza. Netanyahu argued that the United States had done the same in Germany and also nuked Hiroshima. Wasn't the crafting of the Geneva Convention and the Genocide Convention precisely to prevent similar future atrocities like Gaza from happening?
Well, the statutory intent that came out of international law from the Nuremberg tribunals, where the victims were Jews and the victimizers now are Zionists, was designed specifically to offset this. The fact that Joe Biden would take credit for this and using as an excuse or using as a justification the mass mayhem and murder in Dresden, where it was marked as an area that could not be touched. It was a no-fighting zone. Not one, but two nuclear weapons dropped, atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Take credit for these as positive lodestones, as steps in the development of the world, says what Biden is about. Keep in mind, Joe Biden was the other day, he pardoned 2,500, largely people of color, who were imprisoned for years, decades, for nonviolent drug offenses. Keep in mind that this is the same Joe Biden whose Criminal Justice Act of 1994 sent to prison millions of largely people of color for nonviolent, mostly drug offenses. This is the same Joe Biden that passed every bill that supported more guns, more bombs, more death, more destruction for Zionism and Israel. So the fact that Biden, in his dementia, in his dangerous, deadly dementia, would stand up and say, after all, what I did, and take credit for it, is no different than Dresden and the carpet bombing there, or no different than dropping not one but two atomic weapons, speaks volumes about the evil, about the distortion, and about the ignorance of Joe Biden.
So Israel had two objectives for its military campaign in Gaza: the release of all hostages and the eradication of Hamas. It insisted that it would achieve these by force, not negotiation. It has done neither. Is this a defeat for Israel?
Oh, clearly. For years it had this quote unquote subtle, incremental genocide, whether you're talking about, snipers shooting 30,000 demonstrators, civilians, peaceful demonstrators, whether it's the attack, the carpet bombing, the use of phosphorus and cluster weapons every few years in Gaza, whether it's the use of an embargo that controlled the introduction of food and water and medication. This is another step in another process. For decades, ever since the election of Hamas in 2006 in particular, Israel has done these incremental attacks. Meanwhile, in between, they've kept up what is clearly genocide in the world's largest open-air concentration camp. And this was an all-out. It was an all-out by Netanyahu because he desperately needed it to save his own position and to keep him out of prison. The notion that October 7th was a trigger for what Israel done is another distortion, a perverse lie. There have been 27,000 October 7ths directed against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It is an enormous defeat. Israel has lost more and more and more support. It can no longer try to massage the lie. It can no longer promote this, we are defending ourselves. The whole world has seen in plain, clear view what Israel is about. It is a European colonial project that has no holds bars, that would slaughter, destroy cities, displace millions, target civilians, murder women, murder children, always with an excuse. But this time they ran out of excuses. This time it was very clear it was about a political gesture by Netanyahu. What he calls and what people call hostages were mostly captives of war. They could have been released in an exchange a year ago. I know firsthand about two occasions where an even better offer was made to the Israeli Security Council. On both occasions, it was approved by the Security Council. And on both occasions, Netanyahu denied it. He vetoed it. He said no. And why? Because he saw this as an opportunity to destroy Gaza, to use it as a pretext to go after Hezbollah, to use it as a pretext to raise the temperature in terms of Iran, to steal more Syrian land. This was, in every sense of the word, this was the Pearl Harbor of Israel.
After all of this said and done, and assuming all the phases of the agreement go through, and then about 100 hostages or detainees, as you refer to them, are released. What you've been telling me, it's going to be all out there when the families and relatives of these hostages know that they could have gotten all their loved ones, more than something like 250, and now they're getting about 90 something. Will Netanyahu be held responsible and accountable in Israel once and for all? Because he's been like a cat with 9 lives.
He'll build another mausoleum for like Baruch Goldstein. He'll declare a national holiday to honor the memory of those that were lost. He'll call them victims of the Arab world. He will praise them, extol them as people that sacrificed their lives to protect Israel, to allow it to maintain its democratic position, surrounded by a group of predator jihadist states. That's what he's going to argue. The real question is, what will the Israeli people do? And while there have been demonstrations, both tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even before October 7th with regard to the Israeli judiciary, and while there have been tens of thousands demonstrating to quote unquote save the hostages, the reality of it is most of the Israeli body politic is complicit. Most of the Israeli body politic can talk about peace and justice and democracy when these European settlers are perfectly willing to see their state destroy hundreds of thousands of Arabs, of real Semites, in the name of getting more territory, more land, more freedom, and more, quote unquote, of this perverse democracy. So do I think that he will survive this? I don't know. You've got the 3 pending criminal cases against him domestically. You have the ICC arrest warrant. You have increasing numbers of states internationally now seeking to arrest, prosecute, and convict people, so-called dual citizens, young men and women who left different states to go and participated in genocide. You will have increasing pressure by the oligarchs in Israel and their supporters in the West to turn Netanyahu into the fall guy, when in fact they are every bit as complicit. So I'm not sure. But one thing is for certain. He did not defeat Palestinians. He did not break the resistance. He did not destroy the reality of self-determination and the right to have their own state. He did not, be sure of this, he did not destroy, quote unquote, Hamas, because Hamas is Palestine. Whether you want to call it jihad, whether you want to call it Hamas, whether you want to call it the PFLP, whether you want to call it the so-called lone wolves in the West Bank, you have millions of Palestinians who are willing to sacrifice their liberty and their lives for the freedom of their people for self-determination. So the notion that he has destroyed Hamas is just more Trumpish nonsense.
Well, regarding Hamas, Blinken offhandedly stated that Hamas recruits are higher than ever and its presence remains strong in Gaza. What do you make of this? A reflection on the failure of Israel's genocide to eliminate them, or giving a pretext for it to continue its assaults in the future?
No, look, the reality of it is if $1 trillion a month were poured into Gaza, it would take 30 years to get them back to the original pain and suffering before October 7th. What we see happening in Gaza is now happening in the West Bank. We see Zionists hoping to turn Gaza into the West Bank. It's very clear that the Netanyahus of Israel, the right-wing governments, the reactionaries, and the silence of most Israelis are supporting an all-out theft of all of Palestine. Hostages, civilians, it doesn't matter. The agenda is clear. From the river from the sea, for years offended quote-unquote Zionists, but it's the same chant that you hear from them and you hear the Knesset trying to carry out right now. I also expect in the months and years to come, you're going to see an increasing attack on Palestinian Israeli so-called citizens, where they will be removed from the Knesset. You will see a rebirth on the limits of travel. You will see them being isolated increasingly under the claim, the guise, and the nonsense that they were complicit with Hamas or with Palestinian resistance when they were serving as democratically elected, for the lack of a better word, representatives of their own people and their own communities that are living under siege. Look at Jenin.
Right.
The telltale sign was, what was Bethlehem at Christmas? Empty, nothing, gone. It was filled, if anything, with Zionists that were looking at new land to steal. And that's what it's about. So the notion that this quote unquote ceasefire is somehow going to bring peace and equality and justice to the agenda of the Zionists and Israel, both in and outside of the United States, is little more than wishful think.
Well, going to the ceasefire deal itself, it's a three-phase deal with the detail of phase two not being worked out until 2 weeks into phase one, and phase three even less specific. I don't want to go into the summary of what the ceasefire and the potential for it, but we should talk about the potential for it to be derailed as it progresses, as has been the case with all past agreements Israel has reneged on. I mean, what's the likelihood of all these three phases be implemented the way they were written or agreed upon?
Zero. But in reality, even if each and every phase was implemented at day's end, Netanyahu and the Zionists and the Israelis have accomplished what they set out to do. Just pushed it off the table, destroyed Gaza, murdered, destroyed, displaced hundreds of thousands of Gazans, destroyed their healthcare system, a wonderful educational system, and just put off for tomorrow, for next decade, for next generation, for the next millennium, the issue of Gaza as they continue to turn the West Bank into Gaza. So again, this is a political gesture by Netanyahu, approved by Biden, finding comfort in the new Trump administration, if not more. And at day's end, it's just another example of, as Biden says, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden, three of the darkest moments in history, along with the 500,000 children who were starved to death in Iraq by virtue of the sanctions, that the West looks at as accomplishments, as steps in democracy, peace, and justice. The global South and the rest of the world that are the victims of this Western arrogance and violence and imperial design know better.
Well, let's talk. Even if the ceasefire is successful beyond imagination, what has the cost of Israel's genocide been to the humanity of the world at large? It has been allowed to do what was unanimously considered to be unacceptable to humanity: the slaughtering of women and children, destroying hospitals, killing doctors, and targeting healthcare workers and ambulances. It's also exposed the impotence of our institutions of international law. You've mentioned the ICC, and now we have countries breaking away from the ICC, like Poland, and which said that they will allow Netanyahu to travel to Warsaw and to attend, the Holocaust memorial there, and France is kind of reneging, and Germany and so forth. I mean, as an international lawyer, what's left of this international law?
Well, let's also throw I jokingly posted on Twitter the other day that the ICJ order that dinner be moved from 5 to 6 has taken hold. It has exposed once again that the ICJ, international venues and jurisdictions, international law, are those that are designed to be enforced against the global South and to defend and to support the global North. Once again, we have been shown very clearly that international law applies to the occupiers and the oppressors, not the victims. The United Nations, once again, has been established, has been clearly shown as being owned by the 5 permanent seats of the Security Council. The impotence of the General Assembly, that in and of itself, no matter how unanimous it may be in pursuing a just end or an interim step in justice, has been exposed. So I think you're right. I think we're at another crossroad where honesty dictates and demands that we need to take a look on an international level of whether we are going to simply just embrace the hate, the imperialism, the oligarchy of the global north, of the West, and say, oh, well, we've got bigger guns, we've got bigger economies, we have bigger corporations, or whether the emerging global south, or whether areas of other areas of the world are going to force the hand. Keep in mind the strategy of Trump, the strategy of Biden, the strategy of Netanyahu, the strategy of the West has been to turn most of the Gulf into Park Avenue. Has these Abraham Accords are nothing short of welcoming Arab states and states in the Gulf. And I would put my hands out and applaud for Yemen to welcome them into a community that, as long as they have wealth and as long as they have control of their own communities, they are greeted with warmth. But should they lose that, they are rejected. It'll be interesting to see what will happen in Syria right now. I found it, interesting that Khan from the ICC was photographed in Syria just yesterday. Someone who went to quote unquote Israel during the early stages of this level of the Israeli genocide, but would go no further than the Rafah crossing at Egypt to go into Gaza to speak to people, to see people. He chose the pedestal outside. So you're right. This has been an expose, an exposure of the arrogance and supremacy of the West in many, many, many levels. And no matter how many times Netanyahu and Zionists and Israelis like to turn themselves into Semites, into people of color, into a community of the Middle East, they remain a people of Poland. The paradox of permitting someone, if it's allowed, who's wanted for war crimes and for genocide by the ICC, to go to celebrate in Poland, a fascist state like Germany for time immemorial, to celebrate the memory of whether it's 1 million, 2 million, 6 million, no matter how many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews and Christians and members of the gay community and communists who were thrown into camps and executed. It blinks the imagination, the paradox. One genocider going to another country that accepted and embraced genocide to celebrate the memory or to mourn for the loss of victims of genocide. It really is an expose on doublespeak, on double talk, on the paradox of the time, where I said a number of years ago, and I've been quoted often, that the difference between freedom fighter and terrorist is who wins. Once again, we see that definition promoted. Once again, we see Netanyahu and Biden and Trump and other genociders, supporters are actively involved in it, being hailed as freedom fighters and their victims as terrorists.
One final question, and this is a general one, and I hate to have you read in the tea leaves, but I want to ask you, how will the world, not only the United States, is going to look with a Trump 2.0?
Well, like Biden and like Israel that came out of the shadows, Trump 2.0 is going to tell the world, we own it. Myself and my small circle of billionaires, of trillionaires, the multinational corporations, we will dictate. Now, the argument will be, we're doing this in the best interest of everyone. Of course, it's not. The last Trump won, the horror of COVID sort of undid the marching orders. We now have a more experienced Nazi. We now have a more experienced fascist. We now have a president who has no bones, no problems with surrounding himself with an obedient cabinet. I think the next 4 years are going to be a horror. I think the next 4 years we're going to see decisions by the United States government that are driven by corruption, that are driven by greed, that are driven by violence, that are driven by white Euro supremacist political creed. The question will be, how will the world respond? Now, I don't expect Europe to push back, because Europe is also in the midst of a neo-fascist development politically. The real question will be is, how much will the global South take? At what point will increasing numbers of the global South, which represent a majority of the world's communities of color, communities of different faith, communities with enormous natural resources. Will members like the UAE, like Bahrain, like Morocco, will they try to break bread to become part of the controlling ruling class, or will they fight back? One thing for sure with Trump point two, there is no need for a pretext. Whether he tries to turn Trump 2 into Trump 3 or not, he's there. He surrounded himself with the darkest cabinet, the darkest appointment. He has a Congress that can't get off its knees. He has a federal judiciary that has been embracing him by telephone and by fiat every day. So I fear for not just the life and freedom and independence of the rest of the world, but its soul.
Stanley Cohen, as always, a pleasure to have you on Arab Talk.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. Be well.
That's the voice in the face of human rights attorney and activist Stanley Cohen discussing the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. And it was a wide-ranging interview, Jamal. And as we said at the beginning, this ceasefire agreement has just been initiated, and we don't know what the eventuality will look like. People are skeptical on both sides. It's important to know that Palestinians, for example, have been down this path so many times before with the Israelis who promise a ceasefire, but then kill Palestinians during a ceasefire. And then once the ceasefire agreement has been stopped, all-out war is initiated. So it's good that we have the 6 weeks potentially of some quiet and some resumption of humanitarian aid and an end to the immediacy of the genocide, Jamal. But I think, people are very concerned. I mean, we're about to swear in Donald Trump for his second term as president. Biden has left the Middle East in flames because of his foreign policy. I can't say that people feel very settled about this whole period right now, Jamal.
Well, the big question, Jess, is what took this long? Why did it take this long? Especially when Biden admits that he had the same deal 8 months ago. And actually, per my conversation with Stanley Cohen, there was even a better deal days and weeks after October 7th. So, but let's go by the timeline that Biden talked about, which was 8 months ago. Right. And think about how many lives would have been spared had Israel accepted this deal. Or the next question is, why didn't he pressure Israel and Netanyahu, just like Ronald Reagan did with during the war on Lebanon with Menachem Begin, and made him stop? Instead, he kept supplying Israel with bombs and weapons and money to continue killing the Palestinians, and that's going to be his legacy. And so now, coming into a day before the inauguration, that this is of Donald Trump, that the Biden administration wants to take a victory lap. That's not a victory lap. That's a lap, I would say, the lap of shame or the walk of shame for
it's
them.
It's the walk of shame.
For allowing 47,000 Palestinians plus to be massacred and the destruction of 90% of Gaza. And that's basically going to be a major historical blot on the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Jamal. And I think we are only going to be able to fully realize the full extent of how depraved and how damaging the Biden administration and their foreign policy, including their Secretary of State Antony Blinken, what they did to destroy, any prospect of peace in Palestine whatsoever. I mean, you correctly said it. I mean, the Biden administration, and we heard this in Biden's final, address, which was, from the Oval Office a few days ago. It was so disturbing to hear how Biden mentally is constructing his view of the world and of his presidency. It has no bearing to reality. The Biden administration with Antony Blinken is completely responsible for contributing to and creating the atmosphere and supplying the weaponry and the political and economic support for a genocide. And when you ask the question, why did this not happen 8 months ago when the Biden administration had a deal on the table? The painful answer, Jamal, is because they didn't want a deal. And the Israelis didn't want a deal. And Blinken didn't want a deal. And because they didn't genuinely want a deal, we saw continuing bloodshed and an unfolding genocide and humanitarian disaster occur in Gaza. So the only way to frame the Biden administration, Jamal, and the Biden policy is they promoted the genocide, they encouraged the genocide, they supplied the genocide, and the Biden administration will go down in the history books, Jamal, as being one of the most pro-war mongering administrations in recent history. Let's not forget about how they armed Ukraine at the same time and continued that particular bloodshed. So to hear Biden talk, Jamal, it's like he's in an alternative reality. It's the world that he and Blinken live in is not reality.
It's not. And mentioning Blinken now, because we talked a lot about, of course, the ceasefire and about Biden in general, but this is a segue to our next discussion, which is really the last press conference, one of the few that actually Antony Blinken went and faced the media, because he's been avoiding this and going to the press room as he went his final conference, which I'm sure millions of people have seen that and will play some of these videotapes. And it was interrupted. Basically, this was this week on Thursday by two journalists who blasted him over the U.S. support of Israel's war on Gaza before they were forcibly removed from the State Department's press briefing room. And they repeatedly interrupted Blinken, basically within 15 minutes of his 1 hour long press conference. And just like watching, I had to watch these videos several times, yes. And I had to watch because we know for a fact that Blinken avoided going to that press. This is like he hasn't been there. You've seen him on TV, but it wasn't in front of the press. It was in general just addressing a reporter from CNN or so forth. But this is to go, it's kind of like almost like a first come, first serve kind of thing. If press and these smart journalists were there, they had their seats, they have their credentials, they were seated at the table, and they started asking him with the hard questions. The question like Max Blumenthal asking, why did you keep the bombs flowing? Why did you sacrifice the rules-based order on the mantle of your commitment to Zionism? And he wouldn't answer. And then he said, no, you have to wait till the end.
Oh my God.
Of course, till the end, he won't call on you. And they knew that he won't call on them. You're interrupting my speech. You have to wait till the end. And everybody knew, because actually one of the journalists was told he wasn't going to be called on. And that's, Sam Hussein, he asked his press secretary, Miller, and he said, no, we're not going to call on you. It started with Blumenthal, and he had his questions. And let's watch a clip from Max Blumenthal.
Everyone in this room knows we had a deal, Tony, and you kept the bombs flowing.
I'm happy to
Why did you sacrifice the rules-based order on the mantle of your commitment to Zionism? Why did you allow my friends to be massacred? Why did you allow my friends' homes in Gaza to be destroyed when we had a deal in May? You helped destroy our religion, Judaism, by associating it with fascism. You waved the white flag before Netanyahu. You waved the white flag before Israeli fascism.
I look forward to taking questions when I get a chance to
father-in-law was an
finish my
Israel lobbyist. Your grandfather was an Israel lobbyist. Are you compromised by Israel? Why did you allow the Holocaust of our time to happen? How does it feel to have your legacy be genocide? How does it feel to have your legacy be genocide? You too, Matt. You smirk through the whole thing every day. You smirk through a genocide.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt.
Well, that's an amazing clip from journalist Max Blumenthal confronting Antony Blinken on his last and one of few actual press conferences where he faced the media. I have to say, Jamal, of all the press conferences that I've ever watched, that comment and that confrontation with Max Blumenthal confronting Antony Blinken was among the strongest that I've ever seen. And wow, it seems like
Well,
very
I
few
mean, the thing
journalists
is,
have the
yeah, I mean,
who
I
has the
was just going to
courage.
comment. Yeah, I was going to just comment that, the minute he stood up, Max Blumenthal, you could see these two, I guess, State
Thugs.
Department employees, two ladies kind of like coming to his side and trying to get him out. And then he kept talking as he was walking out. Okay. And that's in contrast to the next journalist, Sam Husseini. And Sam Husseini, they had to go and bring the State Department police to literally lift him off his chair, drag him. I mean, this is an accredited journalist asking a question, and then I mean, grab him. I mean, you could see all this video and pictures of him being like, and he's saying, "You're hurting me, you're hurting me." They're twisting his arm and lifting him, and to take him out. And this is something like, and they were mentioning this, that Blinken was there to pontificate about the freedom of the press, and we talked to the media and so forth. When you have these cameras now on millions and millions of people seeing you, what you're doing in the United States, here goes our First Amendment. I mean, we are talking about a press conference for the Secretary of State at the State Department, where you have to use the police, the force, to take a journalist out for asking you a question you don't want to answer. And you're a politician, you're paid by the taxpayers to answer a question.
Well, Jamal, it shows you completely how morally bankrupt Antony Blinken is. He will go down historically as one of the most, one of the worst secretaries of state by far in the history of this country. He's been avoiding the media. He's been a shill for the Israeli media. He's been an advocate for the Israeli military and for the government. And I want to go back to what Max Blumenthal said. It was kind of an interesting comment. I know you caught it. He commented on Blinken's grandfather and
Father-in-law.
Father-in-law being working for the Israeli lobby in Washington, D.C. for a very, very long time. So we see that Blinken is basically a coward. He had very few press conferences. He fomented this genocide. He gave the Israelis cover. He waved his hands. He said, how many times, Jamal, we're so close to a ceasefire. And in the face of all of his comments, Palestinians starved to death. Palestinians were murdered in Gaza. 47,000 that we know of, it's undoubtedly much higher, have been killed. And as the final act of depravity, Jamal, the Biden administration did give the okay to Netanyahu to continue the genocide after the 6 weeks. So we have to credit Husseini and Blumenthal, Jamal. I mean, it's kind of interesting to call the United States, this bastion of free press, and people can say and act and ask whatever questions they want. It's clearly not true. It's the classic example of the Palestine exception, right? So that you can ask me any question, except when it comes to our policy in regards to Palestine. I think this video needs to be watched millions more times to show the reality of what the Biden administration did. They are going to go down, Jamal, as one of the worst administrations.
Well, let's watch also the Sam Husseini questions.
Finally, I just wanted to share this morning.
Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Answer a damn question.
I look forward to answering questions in a few minutes.
You know about Israel's nuclear weapons? Everybody from the ICJ. I was sitting here quietly, and now I'm being manhandled by 2 or 3 people. You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. I am asking questions after being told by Matt Miller that he will not answer my questions, and so I'm asking questions. Wasn't the point of the May 31st statement to block the ICJ orders? You blocked the ICJ orders.
Please, sir, respect the process. Thank you.
Oh, respect the process. Respect the process. Well, everybody from Amnesty International. From Amnesty International to the ICJ saying that Israel is doing genocide and extermination, and you're telling me to respect the process. Criminal! Why aren't you in The Hague? Why aren't you in The Hague? Why aren't you in The Hague?
Sam Husseini speaking loud and confronting Anthony Blinken, basically saying Blinken needs to go to The Hague, Jamal. Very powerful. I mean, this is journalism basically at its best. I mean, this is something that, Blinken has been able to avoid for a very long time. You know what it reminds me of, Jamal? Do you remember that press conference that George Bush gave about Iraq, and some journalist took off his shoe and threw it at George Bush? I mean, that was a long time ago. I mean, we've been reporting on the Middle East for a long time. Husseini really confronted Blinken. Sorry.
Well, the thing is, this was supposedly going to be Blinken's victory speech. I mean, that's
right.
Victory lap. I mean, that's what he wanted to do. Wanted to go there, say goodbye. We did a great job. I was a great Secretary of State. We brokered a ceasefire and so forth. And it blew up in his face. And that's what happened. He was exposed. And, well, here's another interesting thing about this, because, again, if you watch the video again and again, well, guess what? All the other reporters remained silent. And to me, that's a disgrace. No one came to the aid of, Max Blumenthal. No one spoke out against the violence that was against Sam Husseini, dragging him out of his seat. Everybody just kept their heads down and watch. And by the way, I haven't seen, at least thus far, interviews with these two reporters about, like, okay, why were you there? Why did you ask these questions? What was your intention, etc. I mean, of course, the video made its way thousands and hundreds of thousands of times, if not millions of times by now, on social media and alternative media. But basically, wouldn't you think that at least someone from the networks will question why were they ejected? Why were they not? Why weren't their questions answered?
Yeah, good point. But I think your first point is so compelling, Jamal, which is journalists witnessing two other journalists being silenced and, in one case, physically assaulted and saying nothing speaks volumes to how American journalism right now is just held captive by Washington, has been held captive by the Biden administration, and certainly is going to be held captive by the Trump administration coming in this week, because people were afraid to speak up and defend their colleagues and their peers. That, to me, Jamal, is among the most disturbing and disappointing things, because press conferences are supposed to be opportunities to ask difficult and tough questions and to engage in a discussion. This was just, as you said, a victory lap. Well, ostensibly a victory lap. He ended up being, Blinken ended up being confronted and kind of exposed for for basically the dissembler and liar that he is. But at the same time, boy, what a disappointment that these journalists let some of their own peers and colleagues be assaulted this way and then remain silent. It's really disappointing.
I mean, at the end of the day, years from now, this video will outlive Blinken. And when people are going to start talking, or they want to show any kind of sound clip or a video clip of Blinken, this video is going to
Right.
be the one coming first. I mean, everything else about him is going to be forgotten. And I think
As it should.
This video will be his legacy. I mean, this is what was supposed to be his victory lap, is his basically walk of shame in this video. Now, I can think about other videos that will be remembered about Biden, but I can't really say that they'll be about the ceasefire or about his relationship with Israel, etc., because I don't think anything can top off his mumbling during the debate with Trump, when he kind of like was living in La La Land for a few minutes. I think that would be his legacy. I mean, there are many other
Right.
things to say about him, but I think when you remember him, you'll just say, here is a presidential candidate that totally destructed or self-destructed in a couple of minutes because his mind just went flying somewhere else and away from that debate.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because there's many kinds of legacies, Jamal, as you know, and there's the historical legacy that's written on paper, but you're really bringing up a good point about the video or the image legacy. When people refer back to people's kind of tenure in the government, they will pull out video moments, image moments, pictures and videos that are very telling. And I think absolutely this is Blinken's legacy in these two video clips from Blumenthal and Husseini. And I expect this week, Jamal, because the inauguration, the Trump legacy is going to be revived and is going to get another 4 years now. And, it's going to take up a lot of airtime in the media, but what's going to happen? Who's going to interview Husseini and Blumenthal to get their perspectives on what happened in the room, why they chose to say what they said? How do they react to not having their questions answered? I think we need to wait to see if anybody has the courage to do that, to interview them.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.